Hey, Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you're getting sort of value and entertainment out of these videos, all I ask you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. Two things of housekeeping. First and foremost, this episode is sponsored by Addy. It's a fractionalized real estate company here in Canada, starting up in Vancouver. So they've just launched their most recent project. Is actually a multifamily project in Toronto. So again, you can go and invest in that. There's a link below. So go check that out. It's kind of fun. I just do it, throw a couple $100 at each little project here and there, and all of a sudden you've got a pretty cool portfolio. Second piece is the Loonie Hour. It's the podcast that I've started with Keith Dicker and Richard Diaz. Highly encourage you to check that out. I personally think it's probably the best Canadian macro and finance podcast in Canada. I mean, there's not a whole lot of competition, so granted, but again, highly encourage you to go check that out. There's a link in the description below where you can go and listen to the Loonie Hour on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, because there's a lot of overlap to what I talk about on these weekly Saturday videos with which we discuss in the Loonie Hour. So first and foremost, some really important data points this week that we've been following religiously on this channel. Obviously, we know that the latest CPI inflation numbers came out for the month of October. So we had CPI inflation coming in at 4.7%. It's the highest reading again since 2003. So a slight uptick again from last month. And this continues to sort of be the story. As we know, and we're well aware, it's not really transitory, maybe it'll be transitory at some point later next year, but at the end of the day, these prices aren't coming back down. The rate of change will just slow. And so, 4.7%, well below the US's 6.2. But I think there's some important distinctions here, and we talked about this again on the Loonie Hour, is that the Canadian data collection, really, you always have to take it with a grain of salt, right? Like, at the end of the day, I would certainly argue that there's components of the CPI measurement that I'm very skeptical of. And so, for example, one of those ones is, when we unpack that 4.7%, the one thing that I'm right away looking at, and okay, we're peeling it back, and kudos to my buddy Richard Diaz here for pulling up the food inflation metrics in Canada. So, again, according to CPI, food inflation's up 3.8%. I believe they have restaurants, dine-in is up 3.6%. So again, I don't know if any of you are out there shopping at grocery stores or going out to restaurants. I can tell you from my own personal experience that, food inflation is much higher than 3.8%. I mean, going out to a restaurant now, I feel like those prices are up 15-20% over the last, pre-pandemic. And we go to the grocery store. So I always say, where the hell is Stats Canada eating? Because I'd love to shop where they're shopping. And speaking of which, we're obviously well aware now. Watching this closely. So you've got the central banks kind of grappling with, okay, what do we do here? A lot of this is to do with supply chains, etc. And now we just have this, once in a generational mass flood in BC. Where we basically wiped out the farmlands in BC. So, 50%, roughly 50% of Abbotsford supplies the dairy, the eggs, a lot of the agriculture, the vegetables that the British Columbians eat. So basically 50% of your sort of agricultural food was basically wiped out and is currently underwater. So. If you're looking at food inflation at 3.8, I can tell you that thing is going much, much higher. Which again, we have to kind of roll this all back and say, how is this going to then impact larger monetary policy decisions? Again, if you're the Bank of Canada and you say, okay, well, food inflation is going up, now. Again, does a Bank of Canada hiking interest rates solve that problem? Does it solve the fact that Abbotsford is underwater and you've lost 50% of your food source? I don't see how raising the debt servicing cost is going to fix that problem. And so you can almost kind of apply that to a lot of these supply chain issues. Again, we've talked about this before, but it's something that I'm obviously watching very closely. I think you could certainly make arguments that if you're the Bank of Canada, there are very plausible and realistic scenarios where, again, they should be hiking rates based on the fact that, well, you've now got, national house price statistics coming out for the month of October just this week. National home prices climbing another, I believe it was 2.7% on a month-over-month basis. Like having a plus 2% move in 1 month. Again, we have to figure out, okay, if we start analyzing that over 12 months, that's a 24% move in a year. And so now if we look on a year-over-year basis, national home prices are now up 24% year over year. Again, it's the fastest pace of home price acceleration in modern history. So that's where I would say, you have overdone it with the monetary juice. Now, unfortunately, the way that you and I might perceive a central bank's actions, not really how they think and react. And I really want to bring this together. So stay with me here as I explain some important pieces to you. We've talked about everybody's well aware, obviously in Canada anyways, household debt to income ratios are super high. There's a lot of household debt. There's a lot of corporate debt. In fact, just as much as there is household debt. But, we look at this pandemic and we look at all the spending that's happening and, all these CERB checks that have been given out. And we're kind of in this era now of ultimately, left-leaning policy, which tends to be, more social, social programs, right? For the greater good, so to speak. And that's fine. I'm not here to discuss politics with you, regardless of your political leaning. It's just like you have to understand that's just the era that you're going into, right? Like you have these social programs, and ultimately these social programs are run through government deficit spending, right? I mean, they're not collecting enough tax revenues to pay for these programs, but what they're basically doing, is issuing debt, bonds. And in order to fund these programs, in order to pay the interest and service the interest payments on this debt, it certainly helps the Canadian government, which is ultimately the largest borrower. It helps for them to have low interest rates, low servicing costs. And so it's essentially become a point now where the Bank of Canada is actually essentially forced in some regards to support those social spending programs, because they know, well, hey, if we start raising rates on the largest borrower, the Canadian government, that just is going to destroy the debt to GDP picture. It destroys the government's credibility. It basically it interferes with their ability to actually go in and borrow money and run these programs. Now, important distinction, because some of you may or may not, most probably aren't aware. I mean, people that watch this channel probably are, because they're more, in tune with what's happening in financial markets and policy decisions. But the Bank of Canada the federal government updates the Bank of Canada's monetary policy framework every 5 years. It just so happens that this year, that policy framework is up for renewal. So we're getting to the end of the year. It's got to get renewed very, very soon. That policy is set by the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland. If you know her, or if you've been watching, the Trudeau government and Chrystia Freeland and whatnot, you probably know that she's not really a frugal person. She likes to spend. She likes social programs, right? We talk about getting people in the workforce, minorities, equality, and free childcare, daycare, housing affordability, yada yada yada. The list goes on. So Chrystia Freeland has very high and strong ambitions to spend money and create these social welfare programs. Do you think it's in her best interest to have the Bank of Canada sort of cooperate with her. So, for example, typically speaking, the Bank of Canada's over the last 20 plus years, their mandate has been 2% inflation. Just target inflation, and so now we're coming up and we're going to follow, you can mark my words, again, maybe I'm wrong, but I have a pretty strong hunch on this, that we're going to follow other central banks. And what they have been doing is they're having these dual mandates, what they'll call it. So they're not just targeting inflation, they also add labor force. So they say, well, based on the labor participation rate, based on the unemployment rate, just because, for example, inflation runs above 2%, we have a dual mandate which says, well, hold on a minute, inflation might be at 4.7%, but we still have a lot of Canadians, 1 million, for example, to be precise, are actually still out of the labor force. So they can then make the justification or the rationale, the Bank of Canada becomes less pressured to raise interest rates because you have this dual mandate. Now, let me expand on that, where this mandate is going. First of all, you're going to have inflation averaging. So as opposed to just having a 2% target, you're going to be allowed to average inflation, which means that, they can say, hey, well, over the last, 7-8 years, we've averaged about 2%. So yes, right now we're running at 4.7, but we're still averaging around 2.1. So that's okay. And then you tack on the employment as another dual mandate, right? Again, like no Canadian left behind. That's now the third mandate I think is extremely important, particularly as it relates to these BC weather events, because it's just another reason or rationale that we have to kind of put all the pieces together. And that big piece is that, again, politically, whether you like it or not, disagree with it, agree with it, is climate change. So again, I have no strong opinions on it. I prefer just to stay in my lane. But I understand policy, and I prefer to look at it from a finance perspective. And what you can see here is you have to ask yourself, why are central banks around the world adopting? They're now starting to adopt climate change as part of their policy. And you say, well, what is the for example, what does the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, or for that matter, let's say the Bank of Canada, what does Tiff Macklem have to do with climate change? Why is that his responsibility? His responsibility is to set the price of money and to maintain, price stability, which, clearly they failed at. But his job is to maintain price stability. Why does this man have a climate change platform or agenda? What does that have to do with him? That should be up to the governments and the scientists. And what's happening here is, again, whether you agree with it, disagree with it, it's just kind of what it is that in order for governments to run, massive fiscal deficits, massive spendings, they have to have somewhat of an excuse. There has to be a common goal, right? So for example, you imagine, World War II, right? When did we run the largest, budget deficits? It was during World War II. You had to beat the enemy. This was all about, saving the country and freedom. And so there's this common, prosperity and collaboration to work together to win the war and to buy, it was like patriotic to basically fund war bonds, for example, right? And so, the next war, people always ask this, the war now is it's the war on climate change. That's what governments have clearly angled. I mean, everywhere you go, you read about it. It's climate change this, climate change that. And so what's happening is the federal government, for example, is going to be basically allowed to run massive deficits. And the central banks are now introducing programs. They're basically creating a market, green bonds. They're creating a market called green bonds. And basically what's going to happen is the federal government will basically channel credit towards these climate-related projects, infrastructure, etc. And those bonds will be financed or purchased by the central bank. So it'll be essentially funded by the central bank. So this is sort of the common goal, and I think this ultimately comes, like, where am I going with this, is ultimately to say that this is kind of the new era that you're going through. You're going to go through massive deficit spending that's financed by the central bank on the basis that, the war, so to speak, is going to be, the war on climate change. And to say that, you don't support the Bank of Canada buying green bonds, or you don't support the federal government's massive deficit spending in the name of climate change, you will become essentially, an immoral person, so to speak. And so I think that's important to really contextualize here, because I think this is all related as we see, these weather events here in BC, governments coming together with central banks to form these green bond initiatives, etc. So that's kind of something I'm watching on this week, and we're actually going to talk about it next week, I think, in the Loonie Hour, because it's extremely important. Again, politics aside, I don't really care what your stance is on climate change or not, but this is going to happen, and I think that you're entering now. Every time we see, and I've talked about this, there's a great chart. Every time we see debt spike, right? Every time you see debt to GDP blow out, you tend to see real yields collapse. So you tend to see real yields go negative, right? So, as you can see here in this chart, the last great, time again was in the 1940s, when, again, you're going through that wartime period. You had massive debts that were taken on, debt to GDP spiked, and so real yields were basically repressed to allow, basically governments to fund, the war, essentially. And like I said, the war moving forward here will be the war on climate change. And, these infrastructure programs will need to be, financed or initiated with coordination of the central bankers and of the bond market. So again, we don't live in a free market system, and I just find it very interesting that you have to remind yourself that the person in charge of setting the mandate is the largest borrower. Don't you think there's a bit of conflict of interest there? That the biggest borrower is in charge of setting the policy, more or less? And to suggest, the mainstream media economists suggest that they're independent of each other. They're not independent of each other. As we've pointed out in previous episodes, the Bank of Canada, since the second quarter of 2019, has funded roughly 90% of the Canadian government's budget deficit. So, they're working in harmony and unison, and this is all part of the basically keeping a sovereign debt bubble from collapsing. So just imagine this. So you remember in early 2000s, the U.S. stock market, collapsed, basically, crashed, whatever you want to call it, dropped 50%, whatever the, statistic was, give or take. So that happened. You'll remember Paul Krugman at the time, big economist in the White House there, suggested to the government, to George Bush, that he needed to blow out. He basically came out, not word for word, but basically said you need to basically blow a housing bubble in order to get out of this recession. And he was basically said you need to drive household consumption higher, and so that kind of laid the groundwork, right, for rate cuts, and then your housing bubble. And now we're entering a period where the next big thing, right, is, again, like, in order to sort of keep this monetary system alive and going, we need governments to spend money. Like, there's no ammunition left. You've got, private households maxed out in terms of their debt leverage. You've got corporations that are highly levered. You've got governments which really have essentially an unlimited balance sheet, so long as it's monetized by these central banks. And so that's kind of where we're going to put that whole picture together in order to keep it going. When you've got, interest rates at zero and you can't lower them any further, but you still need to derive growth. That growth will come from that deficit spending that's financed by the central bank. So anyways, hope that helped. I know that's a long-winded video this week, but I think I'm always kind of trying to look at the bigger picture. And I think the bigger picture here is that when we see these climate-related events, or whatever you want to call them, it's more ammunition for governments, etc., to run the green initiatives. And these green initiatives are now forming part of monetary policy. I believe that they'll partially form the Bank of Canada's updated mandate here. And so this will create this unison of the central banks and the governments. And I think that we're going to see that's going to spark more longer term, a little bit more persistent inflation. So anyways, as always, hope that helped. We'll see you next week.